Hi, Paige.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Hey, love.
What was that?
Oh, it glitched. I said, how are you, love?
Oh, I'm doing well. Yeah, I'm doing
That was
good.
so funny. Technology glitches. So, for those of you that are listening to the Daring Deeply podcast, hello, I'm David Lee. That's Paige Stuart with Daring Deeply. So, those of you that are listening to the podcast were probably thinking just now, wait, did she not hear him say, how are you, my love? So, I assure you, it's a little bit of technology glitch. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. So, here we are on the Daring Deeply podcast. Today, we're going to talk about trauma bonding in relationships.
Mm,
Woo! Mm.
polite subject.
There's a smack on the ass, smack on the head. Yeah. Mm. You and I were having a brief pre-conversation of the conversation and thinking, what is trauma bonding in relationships? What is trauma bonding? What is, and for so many folks that we help here in our coaching practice at Daring Deeply, we work through what we call a trauma-informed lens, to where we are supporting our clients through life and leadership and relationships and love and passion and all of that through a trauma-informed perspective to help them navigate ultimately that so many of the blockages and the stuckness and the challenges of life in preventing us from moving forward has to do with the trauma that has been unhealed. And so trauma bonding in personal relationships is something that comes up often. And Paige and I thought today, you know what, we're going to talk about that, certainly in our past relationships. And even if it comes up here live here and talking about how our parts, our traumatized parts, have commingled in our relationship, and just reflect on that. And perhaps, what our conversation today can help those of you that are watching or listening with how you're navigating trauma within your own personal relationships. So that's where we're going. You on board with that, Paige? What do you think?
Sounds fun. Yeah, I'm
Sounds
excited.
fun.
As you were speaking, the thing that came to mind, and I'm just gonna put this out there. It's coming to me intuitively. I feel that most relationships are trauma bonds. Most of them, if not all of them. I think all of them might have an element of trauma bond. Trauma bonding, just because there are so many parts of us. And I know that we're going to dive into kind of explaining a little bit more about that parts work and trauma and the self and how all of that lives within us. And therefore, that's how we show up in our relationships, romantic or otherwise.
Absolutely. Wow. Profound statement. I loved how you dropped the mic there.
Right at the
Said that
beginning.
right at the beginning, baby. I can always count on that. That is what we do. Sometimes we come in with sledgehammers. Sometimes we come in with pillows, and somehow it commingles, and we're able to navigate and choose healing over all of it. So,
Mm.
yeah. And let me put a little bit of a pre-frame to that. So the primary modality in which we use in our coaching, friends, is a modality known as IFS, Internal Family Systems Therapy and Coaching, which was developed by Richard Schwartz a generation ago. So those of you that are interested in knowing a little bit more about what that work looks like, his book that he wrote, goodness gracious, 25 years ago or so, I think it's now in its second edition, but really explains this idea that all of us have parts. And these parts were associated and are associated with trauma. And that ultimately we all have a self. And I like to say a capital SELF, self. And the self cannot be traumatized. And it is our powerful, grounded, confident, healing intelligence. Ultimately, healing takes place from this perspective in our use of IFS is when we can develop a beautiful, co-creative, loving relationship between the self and the parts that speak to us and tell us things such as you're not good enough, right? You're too much. Don't go there. All of these things that seemingly sound like a negative response, but ultimately what we've come to understand that these parts always have a positive intent. That once upon a time, these parts were traumatized, and still today, they're trying to keep us safe And ironically, it may feel like they're holding us back. Too often in trauma work, we override and bypass these parts. We tell them to go away, shush, ignore them, bury them. This is where emotional unavailability comes in, right? Ignoring them, pushing them down. I'm okay. Toxic positivity, mindfulness. Oh, I'm okay. I'm good. That was a long time ago. I don't need to deal with that again. When ultimately what we teach and coach here at Daring Deeply is this idea that we must absolutely address and love and befriend these parts in order to realize ultimate healing in our lives. And so with all that said, and that was a lot. So again, I encourage you, those that are interested in knowing more about that, his name is Richard Schwartz, and there's IFS therapy and coaching, internal family systems, parts work. You may have heard this spoken to as well, but it's really the lens in which we help our clients. So today we're identifying, and what Paige just suggested is, oh my gosh, it's really our parts, our traumatized parts that bond to our partner's traumatized parts. And ultimately, we're trying to realize that a beautiful, synergistic, co-creative, loving, elevated, and awakened relationship involves the self falling in love and co-creating with the self of your partner, and that the parts become healed. But too often, again, as Paige was alluding to, that it's our parts that fall in love with one another. And therefore, we develop this phrase, not we, but this phrase is out there that says trauma bonding. We're trauma bonding. Ultimately, how we define that here within Daring Deeply is that the parts are bonding together. Oh, right. You have a daddy wound. I have a daddy wound. So therefore, we're going to connect and talk about our daddy wounds, whatever the case may be.
That's really, really good. I just wanted to pull up the definition here, like, and then we can apply it through our lens. So it says a trauma bond is a connection between an abusive person and the individual they abuse. So that's really intense. And I don't necessarily agree with that. Sure, that is an example of one particular trauma bond, like narcissists with codependency. So like that would be one example of trauma bonding, but like it could even be as simple as like attachment, like a different attachment styles. And because the reason why we have parts that want to attach to other people is because those parts are seeking fulfillment from an emptiness, from not being seen, from not being heard. And so we're attaching ourselves to these people to attempt to get those needs met. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. And we often do this, Paige. This is very interesting. We often find definitions of things and then we redefine them. We're like, you know what, phone friends, we're going to come up with our own Daring Deeply definition, right, of trauma bonding. And I would invite us to consider the idea that it is parts attaching to other parts, right? That is because again, through the definition of IFS, that our parts are the ones that are traumatized. And so if there's a part of us that has attachment issues, right, with a particular family member, for example, they're going to want and attracted to the parts of someone else and say, oh, look, we have something in common. Hence how we would define trauma bonding, right? We're bonding with the traumatic effects of those parts from our childhood. And so therefore, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, really good. That spurs a real life example for me. So like growing up, like always feeling the need to pursue love, attention, affection, being seen, being heard, pursuing. And as we've mentioned on previous episodes of the podcast, like pursuing, that is a very masculine trait energetically. And that is the type of romantic relationships I have found myself in up until ours. Those were all of them. They all shared that common thread of me chasing the romantic partner, saying, see me, love me, appreciate me, show me affection, hear me, be with me. You know, that was a very traumatized part because that was a behavior and a pattern that I was used to growing up.
Yeah. Sound familiar? Those watching and listening? Right? Yeah. as I say, me too. And the polarization was reversed for me. I sought out feminine partners that were more masculine forward, right? Because it felt safe. That is what I experienced growing up. And I bonded to those particular individuals. My parts were bonding to those particular partners' parts, and it felt safe. When in reality, that polarization, and here we bring in masculine and feminine polarity into this conversation, which welcome to Daring Deeply, right? We're going to talk about trauma-informed content and information and masculine and feminine polarity in the context of our relationships. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that resonates, with so many people that are watching is, oh, now it makes sense that what I knew and what I pursued as a child, what I knew to feel okay at the time, well, of course I'm going to continue that, even though, right, those parts were never addressed and never talked to and never had a conversation to begin that healing process. Is, well, it's just simply what I know, which makes sense, right? So much of our work and what so much of this involves in trauma bonding is that we believe that healing takes place when we get over it, when time moves on, right? When it's been 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, we think, oh, I don't think of it that much. In reality, as we know, biologically speaking, right, trauma lives in the body. It's in the body. It's never a matter of mindfulness. We can't get over it, right? Or it's not that big a deal. We talked about this actually last night in our group coaching program, when we were discussing with some of those individuals, that it's so easy for us to say, is this really that big a deal? Is this really that important? Why am I feeling like this is? And yet those around me, right, and even my traumatized parts are saying, move on, right? You've got to move on. You've got to get over this. In reality, every emotion is welcome, which then translates into what we teach and coach, which says every part and what the part has to say to us is welcome, even though we may not want to hear it, right? It's absolutely welcome. And to establish those communication threads to those parts, to simply say, oh, when we're triggered, right? So within the grasp of our personal relationships, when we're triggered, it's really, really powerful to begin and to reframe how we feel triggered, which, by the way, newsflash, no one can trigger you, friends. No one can trigger you. No one can control you. You are triggered, and that's absolutely valid and welcome. But when that happens, is to recognize it as a part communicating to you with a particular need, and to simply ask a question and recognize and say, oh, hi, part, right? There it is. Oh my goodness. And what do you need right now? And more often than not, we'll simply receive an answer from that particular part that can help us establish that communication thread back to that part to begin the healing.
Yeah, so well said. It's so easy for us to distract, override, just simply bypass, because that's what we've been taught. And that's what all the generations before us have been taught too. And so, covering it up with whether it's alcohol or partying or socialization or spending, right? Shopping, purchasing, or just positivity, right? Just slapping some positivity over this or shake it off, you're fine. Like all of that is well, that's just skipping the work. And it's really these instances where those parts begin to blare and chirp up and chime in and have something to say, and here come the emotions, it provides such a beautiful opportunity for us to learn more about ourselves. And then when we can learn more about ourselves, we can better show up in our relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships, just because we have a better understanding of us, and therefore we have taken power over ourselves. And I love what you said, where no one can trigger us, right? Because in those moments where those parts begin to flare, it's like, okay, this is me. This is on me. Hey, I'm going to lean into this anxious part that I'm feeling a little anxious right now. Let's dive into deeper, understand what's behind that. What is bringing the anxious feeling? And what is it that this anxious part needs from me right now? Okay. Is it a few deep breaths? Is it to maybe create some physical space and some physical distance between the situation at hand? Or maybe it's getting into the body a little bit, going for a walk, grabbing some sunshine, maybe doing some stretching. Like, what is it? Is there something I need to say? Like, parts work is so beautiful and profound, and it has allowed us to show up more deeply in our romantic relationship. And it first starts with being able to bravely identify our very own parts so that we can bring them to our partner.
Absolutely. Yeah. So beautifully said, honey. I have a couple of thoughts. One, to acknowledge how hard you and I work, in this, and simply for the benefit of our audience, where does this begin is to simply detach, as you said, and say, my parts are angry right now. There's a part of me, even vocalizing that. When we do that in our conflict, we do that in our common communication. Even if there's not a conflict between you and me, or I should say our parts, is I'm feeling this right now. I'm feeling shame. I'm feeling rushed. I'm feeling this. Helps de-escalate, right? The conflict that's between us, or the conflict that we're having right then and there with our parts. And I think so often, again, coming back to this trauma bonding idea in relationships, is what we have seen is when folks begin to heal their trauma, the trauma bonding within particular relationships, it might be the primary romantic relationship, it might be a relationship with friends, we see that often, is what we call, and in IFS work, firefighter parts, right? That dissociate, detach, distract, i.e. drinking, right? People will say, you know what? I cut back on my drinking. I'm sober curious. I've really leaned into the idea that maybe alcohol is not the best for me. And what they've recognized is relationships that were simply based on alcohol consumption began to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that is an example, a real life example of the trauma bonding being broken. Because we can really analyze and understand, wait, what brought us together? Oh, partying, drinking, drugging, sex, kids soccer, busyness, work, right? Is we often come to this understanding, and sometimes it's led to shame and the loss of a relationship, because we think, wow, just because I'm not engaged in this firefighting activity, right? That again, maybe a distraction, it is a distraction, right? Distracting us from healing the trauma. And we think, oh, was that relationship really based on anything authentic? Was it based on the self connecting and not our parts? And so it's really important in which we teach and coach is that we realize who the self is. And that work is really profound. And that's what we specifically help our clients do. And some of those questions, and I'll just say this here on the podcast. Some of those questions is, what are you doing when you feel absolutely grounded, full of joy, full of happiness, full of playfulness, laughter? What are you doing? Where are you when those moments come into your consciousness? And have our clients, and we invite everyone that's watching or listening on the podcast to do that exercise, is to take some moments and write down, what does it feel? What are you doing when you feel your quote best? That is an identification of who the self is. And ultimately, when we can identify who the self is, the true grounded inner intelligence, as Richard Schwartz describes as the self, then we can begin to connect to those traumatized parts. Because so often we hear this, don't we, Paige, when somebody says, I don't even know who I am. I have no idea. We just led a retreat a couple of weeks ago, and a couple of the ladies said, I'm here to figure out who I am. Ultimately, what they're asking us to help them with is to figure out the self. Like, who am I at my inner grounded, beautiful essence of intelligence?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Powerful. I agree with you completely. And so in identifying like who that self is, right? It's being able to just segregate their parts from their self. And then like their self, like embodying that becomes the witness, right? They then empower themselves to become the witness of all of these other components of them, all these other parts of them that they then can start taking inventory of and start identifying like, okay, what makes up me? because all these parts then drive our decisions and our choices and our behaviors in life. And once we can see, kind of step back 30,000 foot and just say like, all right, I'm the witness here. Who's driving this thing? Who's making these choices? Who's making these decisions? Who's running my day? And it's a really, really, really powerful awareness to bring forward on that healing journey.
Beautiful. I love what you said. And you bring to note this idea, and this is what is expressed in IFS coaching and therapy, is ultimately what happens is the unblending, right? We're unblending the self from the parts, and ultimately asking and inviting a conversation with the parts to unburden, because it is such a burden for those parts to carry around all of those narratives that, as you say, are chirping at us. You're not good enough. You're not pretty enough. You're not skinny enough. You're not successful enough. Be careful. What are you doing? Et cetera, et cetera.
And asking like, what's behind that? Like, okay, I have a part saying that I'm not good enough. Okay, why? Where is this coming from? Where is this stemming from? And just kind of like being super fascinated and curious about that, and really diving deep into understanding what lies beneath it, because that's where the work is. That's where the juice is. That's where the healing lives, and the freedom and the peace, once we can better understand what's driving those parts to sing in that way, chirp in that way.
I love what you said earlier when you said we don't, or maybe you didn't say this, and this is me projecting. I think we talked about this prior to the conversation coming on, is we certainly want to move away from our parts making the decisions on what to buy when we go shopping. Or making the decisions on whether or not we should have one more drink. Making the decisions that, because ultimately the parts, if the parts are making those decisions, it's steering us further away from healing the trauma, right? Because ultimately those parts, of course, have a good intent that says, if we have one more drink, then I can be distracted and won't be hurt again. So again, the part has a positive intent and doesn't know that it's doing, quote, harm and distracting us from the true healing. And so we often laugh and say, I don't want my parts to go driving today because I will go very fast and get pulled over, right? I don't want my parts to be making the decisions at Costco because I will buy everything. Right?
It's like, I think I said this morning, it's like giving them the keys to the Lamborghini. And you're just like, all right, have fun. See ya. Don't get in trouble. When really the person you want driving the Lamborghini is the focused, the grounded, the playful, the excited, the exhilarated, the respectful, the curious, that's the self. You want the self, the self with the keys to that Lamborghini, to that car.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Which I think is a really great place for us to pause this conversation, right? And to bid another farewell. As we know, conversations are never completed. We just put a pause on them. I think to kind of wrap this all around, Paige, is again, with all of this understanding, we want the self to be making the decisions within our romantic relationships, right? We don't want to have our parts bonding to the parts of our partner. We really want to seek out who the truest self is, and then connect the self to the self. Yes, the parts will always be there. It's an important note. We don't ever want to get rid of our parts. Our parts never go away. Okay. Ultimately, what we're wanting to do in truly healing is to identify a new role for that part. And that is another conversation in which to get into, right? But we'll pause it here and to say, ultimately, we want the self to be driving the Lamborghini, if we have the Lamborghini, and we want the self to be driving our romantic relationships and not our traumatized parts. Any last thoughts?
I feel very incomplete with this conversation. I would love to talk about, I'll just take notes for next time out loud here. And when I re-listen to this, I will jot all this down. I would love to know about like, oh crap. So now what? I am in this relationship where my parts have been driving and my parts of my partner have been driving. We are absolutely trauma bonded. Now, how do we unmesh?
Yeah.
And so how do we unblend? And so like, that is a huge conversation that I would love to spend more time unpacking for listeners, for clients. and also kind of how to get your partner on board if they aren't necessarily understanding or interested in the healing journey.
Yeah. Yeah. Important conversation. Sounds like it may be 2 or 3 more conversations.
Yeah.
Because I think, those listening to us and finding some value and impact in what we're bringing to the world are looking for those practical steps. It's like, oh, great. Paige and David have now identified the fact that I've been married for 20 years and we're trauma bonded. Right. And it's just become normal. Is how do we then, I love how you said that, it's to unmesh that. And there are some powerful ways and in which to lead, of course, the self first through this process, and then invite, because it's super hard. Newsflash, friends, you can't change anybody. Right. Let's kind of establish that, as much as we would love to do so. But I think that's a really, really powerful motivator for us moving forward in our next couple of episodes, to say and to give tips and strategies and ways in which to identify and to say, oh, those particular areas of our relationship are bonded by trauma. And it's okay. It's okay that it's that way.
For sure.
For now, it's okay to be aware of that. It's okay to be in that space and not to go down the shame train and to feed the parts that say, oh, great, I thought my relationship was this, and now it's far worse than I thought. So we want to, go ahead.
Yeah, I would agree. And just like we said at the top of the call, well, I love how you said it's okay. Like, it's okay. Because like we said at the top of the call, this is very, 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 very common. And in fact, most relationships probably have some form of elements of trauma bonding. It's just the way that human existence is. And it's normal, it's natural. And when we can begin to bring awareness to it and begin the unmeshment, unblending process and begin to heal and grow as individuals, then together the relationship begins to build intimacy, deeper connection, and the love begins to expand beyond wildest dreams. It's really cool.
Wildest dreams. I think that's pretty attractive. I think wildest dreams is something that we're all
who doesn't want that?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I think you all want that, those listening to us. So, all right, I think it's time to sign off for today.
Let's do it.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you.
So much for being a part of this. And as I always say, if those of you that are listening to us, watching us out there in the world, interested in knowing how we help our clients, specifically through one-on-one coaching, through retreats, we help men, women, and couples really identify so much of what we talked about today, is to really help them become unstuck and to identify the fact that trauma is preventing us from realizing the relationships of our dreams, the careers of our dreams, and to really dig in and to find that support. So if you're interested in knowing that, drop us a line. We can be found all over the socials, websites, daring-deeply.com. And we look forward to having conversations down the road.
Yep.
That's all I got.
We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.